that the Jewish people themselves and Israel itself try to hold themselves to this higher standard, which does limit your maneuverability in dealing with real crises.
Every bit as much now as at the beginning of the state?
The answer to that is, I think, yes. And I was reading Haaretz this morning, and a small news story caught my eye exactly on this point. This afternoon, a group of radical settlers, young people, moved to occupy yet another hillside somewhere, but this time they were being met by a group of radical Israelis from the peace movement who were actually going to physically oppose them. This is a live moral debate in Israel, very much so.
Well, does the roadmap and the quartet process hold any hope? Jeffrey Goldberg, are you optimistic about the prospects for what's envisioned by the Bush administration and has been over the past several years?
No. I mean, long term, 50 years, 100 years from now, maybe things will work out. But I just think, well, I mean, Annapolis and everything. This was all about another issue, Iran, obviously. If you were in the State Department or in the National Security Council and you looked in a cold-eyed way at the reality of advancing a peace process right now, you would say, before we do this, I mean, here you had a situation where the Israeli prime minister is at 5 or 6% popularity. I mean, according to some polls, he's beneath the margin of error. I mean, there might be more Israelis who don't like him than are alive. And then you have a president of Palestine who's not even the mayor of Ramallah. I mean, he doesn't control Gaza, but that's not the. I was just there in Nablus. He doesn't control Nablus either. So you have an incredibly unpopular leader negotiating with a powerless leader. The Palestinian, I think that it's come down to something for the moment. What we have to be focused on is the Palestinians and how they decide what they are. Are they basically represented by a secular nationalist movement, or are they going to be represented by a pan-Islamist Muslim Brotherhood influence movement, Hamas? And until that's settled, it's pretty hard to figure out a permanent status agreement between Israel and the Palestinians.
But it looked like it was on its way to being settled when Hamas thumped Fatah in the elections. It looked like there was an ascendant Palestinian polity, and this is who you're going to have to deal with, and yet nobody wanted to talk to these guys.
To Hamas, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, how can you talk to somebody who doesn't see you? And how do you negotiate? There's a metaphysical problem. How do you negotiate with somebody who can't negotiate with you because he doesn't acknowledge that you exist?
Hamas wasn't willing to negotiate a final settlement. They wanted to negotiate a temporary ceasefire.
Right.
A long-term ceasefire, though. It could be.
Okay, but they were not prepared to enter into final status negotiations, which is what we're talking about. That's what the quartet, the roadmap, is supposed to lead us to. So it's not just that Israel refused to talk to Hamas together with the rest of the world. Hamas refused to talk about the thing that we're supposed to talk about, which is final status.
I mean, there's a deeper problem, which is that if you read Hamas's covenant, much of it is based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I think you're asking a bit much of the Jewish people to negotiate with someone who believes that the protocols of the Elders of Zion are true. It's not even asking too much. It's you're asking the impossibility of a set of negotiations. If somebody is wedded to a fantasy about the way the world is run and that the Jews are a cosmological malevolent force, I don't know how far you're going to get it. Even if you had President Clinton, not Bush, at the negotiating table, I don't know how far you're going to get with that.
But do you get to pick your enemies if you really want to end a war?
You don't get to pick your enemies, and sometimes you can't end the war because you have the wrong enemy. I mean, the good thing, and maybe this is why we'll all 10, 15 years from now realize what a genius President Bush is. The good thing is that maybe
Can I quote you on that?
make it 40 to 50 years,
Okay.
or just any time after I'm dead. All right, you can just use it. Is that he was blamed obviously for pushing elections on the Palestinians and the advancement of democracy, which led to the takeover of Hamas. But maybe, and I was just in Gaza, and you really feel this now. Now that Hamas is actually having to run things, they don't do a very good job of it. Their election slogan was "Islam is the solution." Well, it's not the solution to garbage pickup and paying salaries. And maybe after 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years under Hamas control in Gaza, Palestinians will say to themselves, you know what? We have to go back to it. We have to find a more moderate alternative because we can't live under this kind of crazy rule. So maybe long term that will work out. And maybe there's an upside to the Hamas victory.
Professor Zweig, did Annapolis accomplish anything?
No, probably not, but it did lead to Olmert making a very interesting admission, something that all Israelis are beginning now to understand, which wasn't always true, is that if we don't have a two-state solution, we are heading fast towards a one-state solution in which we will eventually lose a Jewish majority in Israel. That a two-state solution is dictated by the realities on the ground. And we have to get there. Israel's problem has always been, besides Israel's own issues with repartitioning the land and so on, and Israel certainly has many issues about that, but the whole peace process was motivated by a desire to create a negotiating partner. That's what Oslo was about, to bring the PLO, legitimize the PLO, bring them back home, and then negotiate with them. And that process failed, and we are still stuck at the position that we don't have anybody, not even the mayor of Ramallah, that we can actually negotiate a peace settlement with.
Well, I'm interested in that one-state solution point. 1 year, just by circumstance, I ended up sitting in a coffee shop with now President Shimon Peres, and the announcement had just been made that what became the withdrawal from Gaza was now going to be commenced. And I said to Shimon Peres, well, first of all, what did you say to Ariel Sharon to get him to think about this? And where does this end? And he said, look, I told Ariel Sharon something that made sense to him, which is you can either have a Jewish state or you can have all the occupied territories forever. And he thought it was much better to have a Jewish state. Is there a growing sense, you alluded to it just a moment ago, that holding on to the territories also has a cost that becomes over time so corrosive, so large, that you may lose more than you gain by holding on to them?
I think the answer to that is yes, at many levels, not only demographically. What we were discussing before was the demographic consequences of holding on to the territories. There is also a corrosive effect on Israeli society. Being an occupying force now for 40 years, confronting the Palestinian masses, not just the PLO, but the masses, in a violent confrontation for 20 years. This month is the 20th anniversary of the outbreak of the first Intifada, and we've more or less been at it ever since. This has a cumulative corrosive effect, I believe, on Israeli society, on the way Israelis see the world, on our ability to relate to the Arab world. I mean, we should by now be much more down the road on friendly relations with the Arab states. We'll never get there as long as we are fighting the Palestinians. The settler phenomenon in Israel, without getting into the rights and wrongs of the settlements, but the settler phenomenon in Israel has created a unique attitude to law and order, to legality. So occupation has a corrosive effect above and beyond the demographic effect.
Most Israelis want to get out. Most Israelis don't know how to get out. That's the dilemma. I mean, that's the essential dilemma. Most Israelis know in their hearts what we're talking about here. I mean, there was a story the other day out of the West Bank. Settlers from a particular settlement had stolen the donkey of a Palestinian school child on his way to school in another village because he had been crossing their land. I mean, you know, we're talking about the people of Moses and Isaiah and Amos and Jeremiah, and we're stealing donkeys from children. I mean, it's just, there's a level of insanity to what's going on in the West Bank, and that has, I think Ehud Barak went a far distance at Camp David. I really do. I think that on balance, it was Arafat who balked. That Barak was talking about something real. But I have to say that if you're looking at the situation as a Palestinian, you're saying, okay, they want to negotiate, they want to get out of the West Bank, they tell us they want to get out of the West Bank, but the settlement movement becomes more and more ingrained each and every day. And you see a double standard in the application of the law. You see roads being built. The craziest road, if the Palestinians get a state on the West Bank, they're going to inherit the craziest road system in history. I mean, you have multi-million-dollar highways, that go in circles, in triple, quadruple loops, just to avoid Arab villages, to take them to settlements with 200 people in them. Illegal settlements, by the way. So you have, so if you're a Palestinian, you could look at the Israelis with some justification and say, yes, you talk about wanting to leave, but you've empowered this small group of people to stay on my land and to stand and keep their feet on my neck. And so until you deal in a consequential way with the settlers, we're really not going to believe your intentions vis-a-vis the West Bank.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the building of that dilemma and how aware the wider Israeli public was of the nitty-gritty of what was going on there. The United States, first in Camp David, and then in subsequent agreements, said, look, freeze settlements, stop moving people out there, stop building new ones. And on repeated occasions, the Israelis said to the United States, yes, okay, we'll do that. But then when you take a look at a map, in fact, what they were doing were building new settlements apace and just extending the boundaries of the old ones, or just taking the name from one of them and moving it to Settlement B and Settlement C, so there are now 3 of them where there used to be 1, and Israeli ambassadors over the years have looked the Secretary of State in the eye and said, yeah, we stopped building new ones. Now that how much awareness was there in Israel? How much awareness of this was there in a wider world, that this was what was going on? And was there any awareness when it was going on, how hard it would be to undo? Sure.
I think as long as, we'll have to look at when the settlement movement really became large and significant. And that was parallel to the time that Palestinian terror became large and significant inside of Israel. And at the same time, the peace process, historically, is trying to take off. I believe Israelis knew and simply didn't care. As long as they were Palestinian suicide bombers inside Israel proper, nobody really cared about Palestinian rights on the West Bank, which allowed the settlement movement to reach a certain critical threshold. I believe the situation is now changing. There are indications on the ground that the settler movement is transforming itself yet again. And the generation of leaders of the settlement movement that grew out of the moderate religious Zionist movement knew how to talk to the Israeli political establishment. That generation is now becoming irrelevant and is being taken over by a younger generation that was born in the settlements, that is far more confrontational, and is doing things like stealing donkeys from children or chopping down olive trees of Palestinian farmers or poisoning their herds and their sheep. This sort of very extreme generation, I find it very hard to believe that they will have any sympathy in the Israeli public when push comes to shove on the future of the settlements.
Can a prime minister with a 5% approval rating tell them to cut it out?
It's very, very hard to do. It was very, very hard for Ariel Sharon to engineer the pullout from Gaza, which, of course, in the I don't know how you would call it, the taxonomy of settlers. The Israelis saw the Gaza settlers as particularly crazy. I mean, who would by choice go live in the Gaza Strip? And furthermore, there was no. Some rabbis argue that there is a Jewish connection to the Gaza Strip. That's pretty dubious. But
Samson had a terrible.
No, I mean that's the last thing that happened. You look at Samson and you say, "Let me get out of here." But and here's a key difference, and this goes to some of the ambivalence that Israelis still have about this, is that there's no denying that the West Bank, that the spine of the West Bank that goes up the Road 60 is the heartland of Jewish history. I mean, these are the most important. Tel Aviv is not important. Jaffa was not important in the Jewish story. But we're talking about evacuating now these settlements up and down the West Bank from Hebron to Shechem to Nablus. That's where it all happened. And so you have more settlers in the West Bank. You had 8,000 or 9,000 in Gaza. You have many more settlers in the West Bank. You have a true, deep Jewish connection to the land. And you have a prime minister who's not Arik Sharon. Only Ariel Sharon, of all the Israelis who were alive at the time, he's still alive, but it could have engineered that pullout, the Nixon to China idea. So I don't see how Ehud Olmert, he's not even he's not even freezing settlement growth. I don't see how he's going to reverse the growth of settlements.
I'd like to make two observations here. You're 100% correct. It's virtually, almost totally impossible if we look at it politically. But if you look at it, I think, over the longer term, the security wall that is being built now and is very largely completed has in fact been in development for at least 10 years by a previous Israeli government as a separation. There is a consensus in Israel that this is more or less the border. The wall will have to be moved here and there, but this is the border between us and them. There are 65,000 settlers in over 100 small settlements east of the wall in Palestinian territory. Everyone understands, and the settlers do themselves, that they will eventually have to be moved back west of the wall into Israel.
And large numbers of Palestinians west of the wall.
Well, there are large numbers of Palestinians west of the wall.
In places like Silwan, which it's hard to imagine being emptied out.
No, not emptied out. Quite the contrary. If you take
They'll
the
have to be
logical,
offered citizenship in Israel.
they may want it if they were given that honest choice. But what is going to happen is that this fact is going to encourage Israel to change track on Jerusalem. That's why Barak offered to hand over East Jerusalem to the Palestinians. That's why that is the solution that's on the table today. It's the demographic factor. There's one other historical trend that I'd like to mention. In the Israel of the 1950s and 60s, the vanguard of Israel was a tiny section of the population that lived in the kibbutzim. This was the model. These were idealized by Israeli society. The Israeli kibbutzim exist, but they have withered, their numbers have shrunk, they are no longer idealized, they are no longer the model for anything. They have become irrelevant to Israeli society. This was a historical process. I think many of the settlements, especially the ones to the east of the wall, will simply wither away under the right circumstances if we have enough time.
Both of you gave less than glowing reviews to Annapolis, but it did gather a lot of the people who are going to have something to say about whatever happens under one set of roofs, which hadn't been done in a long time. Who on the Arab side can be worked with? Who, whether they're on the list or off that list, must be brought around in order to create some durable, longitudinal settlement that guarantees Israel's security and allows it to be a regional country, a country that lives in that place on the planet where it lives.
Israel can work with any country that sees Iran as a threat. Traveling recently in the Gulf area and reading, exposed to the Arab press in English, throughout the Gulf, in Jordan, in the Emirates, I read the same sort of op-eds, openly calling for an alliance between Turkey, the Gulf states, and Israel against the Iranian threat.
There's nothing like a Persian to make an Arab like a Jew, I think is the point. But I mean, it's true, as long as the Iranian threat is there, you'll see a Sunni-Jewish alliance, which is essentially what you had at Annapolis, the first the convocation of the great American Sunni-Jewish alliance. The Saudis are key, obviously. Egypt is less so than it was. Egypt is less central to the Arab story than it once was. But I have to say that it flows. This is going to have to flow through the Palestinians. You know, there's nothing that King Abdullah in Jordan can do. I mean, there's this talk now that maybe what we need to go back to the Confederation idea that the West Bank should be affiliated with Jordan in some way. I was just in Jordan, and you know, I asked the Jordanians this, and they said, "We'll never ask for that. We're smart enough to know never to propose that. If the Palestinians come to us and say, this is what we want, well, then it's okay. Likewise, if the Palestinians come to the Saudis and say, you know what, as some sort of coherent entity, which we don't have right now among the Palestinians, and say to the Saudis, well, you know what, the Jews can in fact control all of the Western Wall, and we'll deal with the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa. Yeah, I mean, much is depending on what the Palestinians signal to the rest of the Arab world, I think.
And are we moving through a very brief moment in history when some of the things that you both mentioned might be doable that could be easily lost? And here's what I mean. If you look at the demographics in the Emirates, in Syria, in Lebanon, in a place like Bahrain, where the Shiite population is growing twice as fast as the Sunni one, and the bending toward Tehran and away from Al-Azhar and away from Baghdad and away from Damascus is happening. Do you really have to get on this pretty quickly, because soon there will be a sort of Shiite ascendancy that will change facts on the ground in these countries that may be part of the solution?
But you're assuming that Iran today is Iran 10 years from now, is the same Iran. And I wouldn't bet on the mullahs being in charge in 10 or 15 years. I think the historical trend is against them. Of course, people have been saying this for 25 years.
But eventually they'll be right.
I think, you know,
if we keep
right,
on saying
right.
it, eventually.
No, I mean, it's that long, going back to that long-term Bush, you know, pronouncement. You know, in 50
have to
years,
wait 50 years.
Iraq will be better, you know, or 40 maybe, but who knows? But I mean, the point is that you can see some trends in Iran that suggest this. Remember, you know, Ahmadinejad, as loud as he is, isn't the powerful figure there. It's Khamenei, who's a more pragmatic person. So I just would issue that caveat that the Iranians we know and understand, we know today, might not be the Iranians tomorrow. But you're absolutely right, and you know, the perfect example of this is the non-reaction that the Sunni Arabs had to the war in the summer of 2006 between Hezbollah and Israel. You remember the Saudis condemned Hezbollah at the start. I mean, that was an amazing moment, and it's a moment that, let's say, a more subtle or nuanced or sophisticated Israeli government might have capitalized on to a slightly greater degree.
Well, what was the effect? Said they might have done this, but it just left Ehud Olmert reduced, didn't it?
Well, I mean, when you go to war, you have to win the war. That's sort of